The Business of Agriculture is brought to you by Land Trust. Have you heard how landowners are increasing profitability by adding recreation to their portfolio of land use? Millions of outdoor recreators seek wide-open spaces for birdwatching, photography, hunting, fishing, horseback riding, and many other farm and ranch activities. Landowners are partnering with the Recreation Access Network, Land Trust. Land Trust is an online platform connecting recreators with landowners for outdoor experiences on their land to increase profitability. Visit landtrust.com/BOA, as in Business of Agriculture, to learn more. That's landtrust.com/BOA.
Greetings and welcome to another fantastic episode of the Business of Agriculture podcast. It's me, your host, Damian Mason, but you already knew that because you heard it in the introduction. The introduction, of course, was talking about Land Trust, one of my favorite sponsors. In fact, I'm so glad that you listen to this podcast, and I would love you to check out Land Trust. You know, a lot of landowners around North America are making money by discovering the ecology economy. Somebody wants to watch birds, catch fish, hunt, walk in the woods. They might just be paying you to utilize your property. So do indeed help my sponsor, Land Trust. Go check it out. Today's episode, we're talking about the soybean. You know, almost 90 million of America's 350 million crop acres are devoted to soybean, a crop that we basically didn't even produce a century ago. Only about 100,000 acres of soybeans in this United States of America a century ago. We grew things like flax, oats, and then all of a sudden the soybean comes along, and from 100,000 acres a century ago to almost 90 million or 88 million acres today. I have with me Mac Marshall. He's the Vice President of Market Intelligence with United Soybean Board. He's going to talk to us all about soybeans, the myth of food versus fuel, where all these bushels of soybeans on all these millions of acres are going, what our position looks like here in the United States of America in terms of a global competitor, what's going to happen for the future of soybean producers, the process, and the entire soybean complex, if you will. We're going to be getting to all that stuff. I got a great guest. He's a good dude. And if you were tuned in, and a lot of you listen to this, I realize, but a few of you tune in to my YouTube channel where you can watch this podcast, you'd see that Mac is not just a soybean guy. He's brilliantly handsome. He's like a bald-headed guy. He's sitting here looking at me. And it's like, I mean, you've never met a guy this good looking in soybean, I promise you. Anyway, Mac Marshall, welcome to the Business of Agriculture.
Well, I have to say, Damian, it's a pleasure to be here. And I'd be remiss if I didn't also say that's the best introduction I've ever got. And I hope that that's a running at the chyron at the bottom of the screen. You know, best looking guy in soy biz.
Essentially, I don't do very many things well, but you just saw it. Introducing my soybean guests on the podcast is something I'm capable of doing. Mac Marshall, Vice President, Market Intelligence, United Soybean Board. All right, we're going to assume that everybody in this, listening here understands at least soybeans. We're going to get a little bit more into that because I have a lot of listeners that aren't even really farmers; they're ag industry people, and I have even people that are not ag industry people that listen to this because it's very educational, gives them a broad-based thing. Let's start with the basics. What is the United Soybean Board? What is it?
Well, yeah, so I think we need to look collectively at the Soy Network here, right? So, you know, I've worked for this organization for just over a year. I joined it during the middle of the pandemic. And before that, I knew we had the American Soybean Association, we had the United Soybean Board, Soy Checkoff, and USEC, U.S. Soybean Export Council. So a lot of alphabet soup there, a lot of stuff to parse out. So I think the simplest way is, you know, let's start with the Soy Checkoff. Now, there are lots of checkoff programs in this country for a number of different commodities. For soy, our name is United Soybean Board. And what we do is, as part of any other checkoff program, a small percentage of every bushel sold, goes in, is retained by the states of production and retained by the national organization, and then reinvested for marketing, promotion, reputational enhancement, unlocking new barriers for additional soy inclusion in various emerging and novel applications. So it's about marketing and promotion. And then the international marketing wing of that is actually managed by USEC, the Soybean Export Council, in terms of global promotion, showcasing the value of whole beans, meal, and oil all around the world. U.S. or soybeans, of course, are an export-oriented crop overall. You combine beans, meal, and oil together. We export about 60% of that on volume terms. So that international marketing component is really critical. Now, one thing we don't do in the checkoff under legal parameters is we don't lobby. We don't engage, with the administration or legislators, for the purpose of influencing legislation or anything like that. Every commodity organization has some ties, I think, back to Capitol Hill. And for us, that's the American Soybean Association, which manages kind of the political realm of things, things like farm bill, infrastructure bill, connectivity, those sorts of issues, biofuels policy, all that being managed by the American Soybean Association. So that's the alphabet soup of the soy world in a nutshell.
The United Soybean Board is essentially the promotional arm, and you said check off dollars. To my friend, like my buddy up in Evanston, Illinois, he listens to this so he can be smarter about ag stuff. He's saying, what the hell's the check off program? So in the 1980s, a couple of ag commodity groups got together and said, you know what, we need to spend some money on promotion. So these farm producers out here, they grow these soybeans. And so for every bushel that they sell, you grab a penny a bushel or something like this?
It's half a percentage point of the sales price. And that's split evenly between the state of production and the national organization. So for us, it's a quarter percentage point.
All right. So yes, half a percent. So $12 soybeans. So running the numbers here, that means you'd be at 12 cents. That's 6 cents. We're talking about 6 cents on $12 soybeans.
Yeah. 3 coming back to us.
3 comes to you and 3 goes to the state.
Yep.
All right. So every bushel, you're getting 3 cents. What are you doing with that money?
Well, it's a lot of things. First off, as we look at how we're allocating, marketing promotion, I talked earlier about how USEC is handling our international market promotion, and there's a large chunk of the money goes into that in terms of showcasing globally the advantages of U.S. soy, and that's promotion activities. But it's also some investment in centers to help showcase that. So one of the initiatives that we've been undertaking these last couple of years is standing up these soy excellence centers. We've got 4 of them globally in Egypt, Honduras, Thailand, and Nigeria as well. So the goal there is really an extension of some of the existing marketing promotion work that USEC has been doing, where it's worked with industry that has already been stood up within a destination market. This is now looking at the next generation. You look at a lot of parts of the global South and the markets that I just mentioned before. These are all the markets that are evolving over time. We're seeing increased economic prosperity, which translates into increased protein demand, which means that operators there in the animal ag space and then the food space, the animal feed space, as well as crushing, they're going to need to have that capacity build up, knowledge transfer, and everything. And that's where the soy excellence centers are coming in, is really kind of getting ahead of that demand curve so that those operators in market are best positioned to meet that burgeoning demand. So that's one component of the international piece.
Hang on. What I think we need to do here?
Sure.
I went ahead and asked you about where the money is going. I think for the some of these folks, let's say that I'm just out here, I'm in the beef business. I really don't know that much about soybeans. We better even go back another notch. You just said some words there about animal feed versus the crush. And now that's the vernacular that you work in every day. But the person that does not work for the soybean board or that does not grow soybeans is saying, what in the hell is he talking about? The animal feed versus the crush. Let's go back to the actual process, and then we'll talk about what you're doing to help increase demand.
Perfect.
In these fields, and you understand why I'm doing this, Mac. It's not in any way correcting you. It's that you're speaking maybe over the head for somebody. Down the road from me, there's a lot of soybeans. In fact, I'm in Huntington County, Indiana. Soybeans is probably our number one crop. I think we actually might do more soybeans than we do corn, but let's just say it's roughly the same. Doesn't matter. Most people don't know this, but the average farm person does. We're generally a corn and soybean rotation every other year here in these fields. So those soybeans get harvested. Some of them go in a grain bin. Some of them get put on a train. They get put on a truck. They go somewhere. And then what's happening to those soybeans that then you can influence and help sell more of them? So that's where we're going to start with. What happens to those soybeans?
Yeah. So let's start with the whole value chain process there. I think it's a good point for grounding. right? So once you've gotten the beans, taken off the combine, either put in on-form storage, but the next place that they're typically going to go is going to be at a crush facility, either domestically here if we're crushing here, within the States, or if they're going over to China or something, which is a large importer of whole beans, they're going to obviously crushed in the country of destination. But what happens at crush is, basically the oil seed gets processed and turned into two co-products, which are meal and oil. Now, there are obviously a couple other oil seeds that are out there. You hear about sunflower seed, rapeseed or canola, and all of them, we have different fundamental profiles, different oil content. So for soybeans, you crush it and you basically get, if you crush 100 pounds of soybeans, you're going to get about 79 pounds of meal and about 18 pounds of oil. So it's roughly a 4-to-1 volume split in terms of meal and in terms of oil. Now, where we're actually using those end products, that's when it starts to get, I think, a little bit more interesting. So a post-crush meal is primarily going into animal agriculture. About 97% of the meal that is used within this country goes into animal feed rations, primarily poultry and swine. Dairy to a lesser extent, aquaculture to a lesser extent, and a cursory amount going into beef, companion animals, etc. On the oil side, and this is where it's really fascinating because I think there's a lot of evolving elements in the marketplace right now, which I'm sure we'll get to in a little bit. But soybean oil used in biofuels applications, traditional biodiesel, also the emerging space of renewable diesel, which can actually wholesale replace existing petroleum diesel applications. Certainly going into food, soybean oil, you might also see as vegetable oil, quote unquote, depending on the formulation that goes into chips or cookies, snack crackers. You see it all sorts of other things. It's used as frying as well in a lot of restaurants. So there's obviously that food channel, and then there's that biofuels channel. But then there are also more diversified industrial uses as well, where through soybean oil we can help stabilize concrete or utilize it in asphalt applications, or in tires as well. That's an application that's evolved in the past couple of years, where through research funded by the United Soybean Board, the soy checkoff, we've been able to develop and advance new utilization opportunities, basically new demand channels where soy can take a greater hold as an ingredient. So you wouldn't think necessarily before of rubberized tires utilizing soybean oil in it, but through the result of checkoff research partnership with Goodyear, we've been able to advance that. And the same holds true for concrete and asphalt. Just to name a couple examples here, and those are all predicated on the investment of those soy checkoff dollars.
All right, so Mac, here's the thing: we're just because again, we always pretend that the person listening to this knows something about it, but maybe knows nothing about it. 80% of a soybean bushel essentially goes to animal feed. And as you said, poultry and pork, big. Dairy, it depends because they use other protein sources, like, for instance, alfalfa hay. Poultry and pork cannot because of their monogastric animals. They're not four-stomached ruminants. They can't process hay. So that's why they need for a protein the soybean. So the bulk of every bushel that we harvest out of these fields goes to an animal that's going to then produce protein for human consumption. So we're going to take that and soybean and turn it into a pork chop or a chicken breast and maybe a gallon of milk, as you said. Then 20% of it roughly goes to soybean oil through the crush process, right?
Yep.
It's crushing that turns it into oil, you said.
Yep. Those are the two co-products that come out once a bean has been crushed.
Once they're crushed, then you get 20% in an oil product, or 19%, as it were. And then that's where now the average consumer that I live next to when I live in the suburbs of Arizona, all they ever think about is how they use it. Oh, I saw soybean oil at the grocery store. I'm like, yeah, that's a spit in the wind in terms of total consumption, in terms of the amount of demand. How much of the entire soybean crop ends up as soybean oil next to Wesson oil or Mazola at the grocery store? It's probably like 1%, right?
Yeah. So you look at our soybean oil balance sheet, it's a balance sheet just kind of, explaining, how much is produced and where it's ultimately used and consumed. And that food application here in the U.S. is about 40%, 45% thereabout.
Of oil.
of oil, of the oil, that's
of the 19%, 40% of it ends up being in the human food.
Yeah, going into food categories. I mean, the category that it's captured in is food, feed, or other industrial uses that don't apply to biofuels. Mm-hmm. So when you look at that 45% usage rate there, that's going to be inclusive of whether you see it as an ingredient in baking, for example, or utilized in the restaurant sector, or as a component for mayonnaise, salad dressings, all that sort of thing. That's roughly 40 to 45% of that 19%, and that's just what what's retained here. Obviously we have it going into export channels as well.
Yeah. Okay. So the where you're spending money, or where that checkoff dollar that is paid for by the producer is going, is for research, as you said, new ways to put soybean oil into a tire. Plastics, I know we're doing some stuff there.
Oh, yeah.
And you're spending money on that to help create demand. By the way, you spend this money on research probably by giving grants to universities, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's certainly nonprofit and public partnerships. We also work with private sector entities as well. Of course, with the caveat that if there's something that's reaching commercialization, we get the cost recovery. We're not going to have farmers subsidize something that does become commercially viable without getting that money back, so that we can reinvest it if it does become commercially viable. But yeah, we've got partners, kind of all across, and of course partners within the nonprofit space as well. Partnering with other export-oriented commodity groups such as U.S. Meat Export Federation, or USAPEC, which is an analogous organization for eggs and poultry. Those are all, I think, really critical demand channels too. As you mentioned earlier, we're using a lot of the soybean meal here domestically to feed pigs and chickens. So, being able to export out value-added, animal protein in the form of ready-to-eat pork or chicken is, it's really a really excellent disappearance channel that we have as well.
Talking to Mac Marshall, Vice President of Market Intelligence with the United Soybean Board. I'm going to ask him next about the whole myth of food for fuel. And then we're going to talk about the reality of fuel. Electric vehicles don't need diesel. Electric vehicles don't need ethanol. Not being mean, just kind of telling my farm people that there's going to be some big changes. We're going to cover that after I remind you here of this little commercial break that you should be checking out extremeag.farm. It's by a new role I'm working with Extreme Ag. Extreme Ag is a consortium of 6 high-producing farmers from different parts of the United States of America, different geographies, different farming operations. One thing that they all have in common: they are experimenting and trialing new stuff, cutting-edge stuff, and getting some big results. They're also getting some failed results. So why am I telling you that? Because by tuning into extremeag.farm and their Cutting the Curve podcast that I am helping them produce, you can learn from their mistakes as well as their successes. You can essentially let them be your guinea pig and say, wow, I heard about this new biological product. That's really cool. What is happening with that? And you can see the trials that they are doing. So Cutting the Curve is a podcast. It's more than that. It's video, it's audio, it's stuff that I'm helping them create to help you. If you're a successful minded person and you're in the business of agriculture, you should check it out, extremeag.farm, and check out all the videos that I'm helping them produce. And while you're there, you might even subscribe and become a member of Extreme Ag. Okay, Mac, you got 51.5 bushel average according to today's prediction. I'm recording this, dear listener, on October 12th, 2021. Just come out with the numbers, said 51.5 bushels of soybeans. That's a record. Now, 175.6 on corn. That's off our record a little bit, right? Because the Western Corn Belt had some challenges on some temperatures. That's over about 88 million acres. 51.5 bushels per acre over 88 million acres. That, my friend, is one hell of a lot of soybeans.
It certainly is. It's actually a record. With the revision today, we surpassed the 2017 and 2018 crops. And as it stands right now, 4.45 billion bushels would be the highest production year on record.
I was going to say, so that's about 4.5 billion bushels. And there you are. Hey, Mac, good talking to you. By the way, we got 4.5 billion bushels of soybeans to sell. Get after it, boy. What happens now?
Well, what happens now is as the beans continue to get harvested, I think we're about 35 to 40%, harvest complete at this point in time. And, those beans are starting to make it to those aforementioned processing facilities where they're going to be crushed in meal and oil, or they're making it, down the river or, across on rail over to the PNW or down through the Gulf to be exported as whole beans to customers around the world. We have a lot of critical whole bean buyers. China, far and away, are the largest buyer of U.S. soybeans. I think we saw a lot of that in the headlines over the past couple of years. Now, fortunately, that environment has changed relative to the trade frictions of 2018 and 2019. China bought over 35 million metric tons this year. That's almost it's close to a third of the total U.S. crop size from last year. So
that's a question now on the numbers thing. We export what? Over a third, almost a half of all the soybeans we make?
Yeah, we exported about 2.2 billion bushels this last season on a crop size of about 4.2 billion.
Yeah, so we export more than half of all the soybeans we make here in the United States. And of that half or so, 50 to 55% that we're sending, half of that goes to China?
It's not quite half of that. Well, yeah, no, it's more than that. I'm sorry. So this year we exported 35 million metric tons to China alone, and just under 62 million metric tons in total. So China's far and away, the whale of a destination market here. But that's not to say that it's the only notable play. One thing that I found is interesting, as we got the full year official trade data, we set a volume record for whole soybean exports and co-products as well. If you lump it all together. But among our major destinations, China included, we didn't set any individual records, at least not among the top 10 destinations. So, I mentioned earlier about some of the investments that have been going on for international marketing and promotion. Part of that is looking at market diversification. You can't have all your eggs in one basket. I think the trade frictions of a couple of years ago really brought that home in the soy world. So, being able to invest in other markets around the world, that can have a growing preference and taste for U.S. origin soy and soy meal and soy oil is pretty important here too. So, you look at our top 20 markets, and it's every continent is represented one way or another. I mean, and some of these weren't even really viable, 10, 15 years ago. One market that comes to mind is Ecuador. It's a big soy meal market now. We export, over 500,000 metric tons there. It's top 10 market for meal. And 15 years ago, there was no importation of soy from the U.S. or anywhere really. It's really
cool,
taken off.
That's cool, by the way, Mac. But I live in Indiana, where we got about 7 million people, and if I'm not mistaken, Ecuador's got about as many people as the state of Indiana, doesn't it?
Yeah, but it's not just for Ecuador. Ecuador is an aquaculture hub, which is producing for re-export to a bunch of other places. So it's not just about what's consumed, within the populace of Ecuador. It's what Ecuador is contributing out. So there's a value-added component as you go through each stage.
And you went right to aquaculture, because I was going to impress my listeners with my knowledge that I've worked with the Shrimp Association and shrimp producers. India is the biggest, and then you got Indonesia, Vietnam, China, and Ecuador, I think, rounds out your top 5 shrimp producers. So we send them our soybeans, they feed them to shrimp, and then they ship those shrimp to the rest of the world.
Yep.
Essentially, Mac, what I'm saying is you out smarty pantsed me right there. I was going to be the one that was sort of being the smarty pants, and then you out smarty pantsed me.
No, I think I more outkicked my coverage. It's football season, so I'll go on that one.
Mac, let's talk about the fact that then, that's cool, but, and I'm going to be, devil's advocate here. Hey, great. Ecuador bought a bunch of our soybeans. What the hell did you have to do with that? They needed soybeans to feed their shrimp. How did Mac Marshall accentuate that? Because they were going to buy our soybeans anyhow. Play the devil's advocate.
Well, the question is, why would they buy our soybeans anyhow? We're not the only producer in the world. We compete in the commodity market. You've got beans coming out of Brazil. You've got beans, meal, and oil coming out of Argentina. Argentina is actually the biggest crusher in the world and biggest exporter of soybean meal and soybean oil. So why would someone in a third country choose U.S. origin meal? Mm-hmm. Well, it's about demonstrating some of the intrinsic differences there. And I think it's about showcasing and promoting what those differences are between U.S. origin products and other origins. And this is a big part of the Dare to Compare campaign, which is being run by USEC. And we're pivoting on some of that, but it's basically comparing U.S. origin meal, how it actually how animals who consume it perform, and reconciling that against meal from other origins, including Brazil and Argentina. So you have the animal performance piece there, which the research for that is funded through checkoff dollars as well. So that's I think a big piece for moving that. And then there's also the capacity building piece that I mentioned before, right? I mean, you have like these industries that don't necessarily exist in a given market, and I picked Ecuador as a representative highlight here, but the same applies in other markets. Going back, what was needed to achieve the escape velocity, for lack of a better phrase, on their aquaculture production. You have to have that dedicated food source for it that's going to be that's going to have high utilization and efficacy in the animal as well. And by virtue of us investing in that market, doing the capacity building, doing the knowledge transfer, working with nutritionists, showcasing the fundamental differences in what we're producing versus other origins, and how it really translates into an improved bottom line and animal performance. These are all, I think, critical marketing activities that USEC is executing on behalf of the U.S. soybean industry.
I don't think that what you just said there lessened the listener's belief that you are indeed a smarty pants, but I appreciate that. All right. So, Mac, my question now is, starting about 2009-10, when we had this big run up, out here in the countryside, we were getting rich. Agriculture had a big, huge super cycle, which we don't see very often. And we saw it between 06 roughly, 06 till about 014, right?
Yep.
And then people started screaming. The same sort of people that sign petitions outside of Whole Foods. No food for fuel. People are starving, so you greedy people can drive your SUVs. Now, I think they're more directing that at ethanol. But the reality is, as I point out, in that box of cornflakes that doubled in price, we went from 3 cents of corn to 6 cents. And so they marked it up $2 more per box. Is it really because of the 3 cent bump in corn? So a lot of the consuming public doesn't understand the amount of our product that is actually in their box of cereal or whatever it should be is not as great as they might think. What's your stance on this whole food for fuel thing? It's not as common of a sentiment as it was a decade or so ago during our last super cycle, but we're hearing a little bit now because food inflation is upon us. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think the historical context here is really important, and bringing it back 15 years to the first decade here, when we first had the ethanol build out, when we had the renewable fuel standard get implemented here in the U.S. That was actually, I started working as a commodities analyst in 2006, so it's near and dear to my heart to think through the history of some of this. So one, on the ethanol side here, I agree. I think the food versus fuel argument got postulated a lot more back then, which is not to say that it isn't getting, bandied about now in the soy world. We'll come back to that in a minute. But, when it comes to ethanol, I think one thing that was fundamentally misunderstood there is, look, okay, you're putting a third of the U.S. corn crop into refining for ethanol. And people think, okay, that's a huge volume. 5 billion bushels of corn are going into there. And that's the opportunity cost of that, saying it can't be used in food applications. Well, one thing that's missing about that is, okay, what happens once you run a bushel of corn through an ethanol facility?
Yeah,
Well,
you take the alcohol out of it, or you take the carbohydrate essentially, right? And then you're left with still a bunch of leftover that corn, the rest of the corn, right?
Yeah, you're left over with the dried distillers grains. Now, what do you do with dried distillers grains? Well, it's a high protein, source of animal feed. So it's still finding its way into effectively the food value chain. And I think that's a nuance that was underappreciated by the general public, 15 years ago. And now where we are, with soy, where, since the start of the year, soybean oil prices are up close to 40%. A lot of that is being driven by pretty substantial domestic demand here, as renewable diesel, which I touched on briefly earlier, is we're getting a lot of demand for feedstock for soybean oil to be used in the production of renewable diesel. So a lot of interest from the energy space. Now, what that's doing, as we've seen those soybean oil prices come up, and I think a lot of that is promoting some of the food and fuel discussion we're having now. Well, I think another little bit of grounding around that. So historically, I mentioned earlier, right? You crush beans, you get about a 4-to-1 ratio of meal versus oil, right? So historically, you're always crushing for meal. So on a value basis, the rationale for crushing has always been oriented on meal. Oil has contributed maybe a third of the value there. Since January, we've seen that ratio fundamentally change. In the first quarter of the year, we saw that long-term average of oil contributing about a third of the share, jump up to about 36%. Since April, going through now, it's mid-October right now. We're closer to parity, somewhere between 45 and 49% on a daily basis, depending when you look at it. So now, with oil and meal effectively being on a value basis equal contributors to the value of crush, the rationale for crush is changing. We're, increasingly crush is being done for oil. Now, what does that do? Well, that's made meal a lot cheaper as well. We've had meal prices come down about 20% over that point in time. So, if we go back a year, look at the first couple months.
You're saying it brought down meal prices because it decreased demand for the meal.
Well, it's more of that it's being crushed for oil, and you start to have this meal glut as well, and the price comes down for that, and effectively becomes some degree of cost mitigation in the animal ag space. Not to say that there aren't other inflationary pressures. Oil crossed $80 a barrel the other day for the first time in a couple of years. Of course, we have like labor shortages and issues. There's all the transport issues as well, and all those are contributory factors towards overall inflation. But I'll say, if we're looking at the food value chain here and the role that soy plays in it, and going back to what I said before, 80% of what you're producing is meal, 97% of that is going into animal feed here. Even as we're seeing the surge in demand from the renewable energy space for soybean oil on a volume basis, our biggest contribution still remains animal agriculture and getting into the food value chain. And where we're seeing that reduction in meal prices, that's where it impacts. So that's not to say that overall, like, consumer level prices are going to come down or anything like that. There are all those contributing factors that I said before. But for soy, we've always crushed for protein in the form of meal. We've always crushed for lipids in the form of oil, just to put it very simply. And now, there are two really existential challenges that I think the world has to face. And I'm excited that we play a role in meeting both of them. And those two challenges, not that there aren't more than this, but two: increasing food security on a global basis. I think that one is always there. We've always traditionally played a role in that. But there's also, energy transition and independence, looking at renewables. And I think the fact that we, in the soy business, play a role as in supplying a critical feedstuff for the production of that is not to be understated. We're playing a direct role in contributing towards advancing food security on a global basis and energy independence.
All right. We're getting long here, but I got to go with this one.
Sure.
We know that we need to export these soybeans because we don't use so much here. Every other country, Argentina, Brazil, two that we know of, Ukraine's gotten on the whole soybean party. Probably a couple of those countries that end in stan: Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Makistan. What happens when we don't need this? We don't need this for soy diesel because there's going to be electric cars. They're being mandated. I mean, I'm not being mean. They're being mandated. Like California says it's going to be electric cars in 10 years, and Oregon and Washington followed suit because that's what they always do, whatever California does. So we're not going to need as much. And I get what your point is. Not a lot of it's going to diesel right now anyhow. And then also other countries are ramping up their production. Do we end up just growing less versus this year being a record? Do we end up growing less soybeans 10 years from now?
Well, I guess to unpack a couple of those things there. So one, I don't want to conflate, the electric vehicle argument and what it means relative to diesel, because I think fundamentally when we talk about electric vehicles and mandates of a greater share of vehicles being electric, powered through electricity going forward, that's oriented primarily around passenger vehicles, which are not using diesel to begin with. I mean, those are using, traditional gasoline, ethanol obviously goes in as an oxygenate there, but it's the long haul fleet vehicles and trucks and everything, that are using diesel. And that's where the renewable diesel piece comes in. Electrification is not necessarily targeting that on the same level. So I think the end market there and the utilization of fuel, I think that discrepancy is an important distinction to lay out. I think the other piece too is, let's look at other vehicles that are out there. Would be it marine fuel or sustainable aviation fuel or SAF. And I want to make clear the S there stands for sustainable, not necessarily.
You're all of a sudden, we throw some more Toyota Priuses out here or Teslas, but your point is that's not a spit in the wind compared to these tankers that are going across and these cargo ships. They're not probably going to be run on batteries is what you're saying. So we're going to be diesel powering all of the the world shipping. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's part of the progress here and the advancement, right? Is recognizing that airplanes and ships, as well as applications for home heating oil. These are all advancing. I think next generation biofuels that are looking for more sustainable sources of energy, and that's where I think the bean oil play is really critical because I can see us playing a role in all of those channels here. But I think those are all materially different end markets than what the passenger vehicle market looks like.
You promised, Mac, you're going to unpack some of my other statements there about the fact that other countries joined the bean party. Other countries have certainly joined the corn party. China didn't grow any corn at any really appreciable level until about 2 decades or so ago. Now they're the number 2 corn producing country on earth behind the United States. Soybeans. I mean, is it going to get to where are we going to not need to produce 4.5 billion bushels? I mean, what's it look like?
Well, so first off, let's rewind to planting season this year, right? Okay, we brought in, roughly 4.5 million acres higher than what we did last year. A lot of that was predicated on, strong prices. This is not a record acreage. We planted 89, I think, in 2016 or 2017, I think it is actually. And going forward, if you look at it all like on a global basis, as we've had prices come up, it's also incentivizing increased production in South America. Brazil is, their planting is already underway. I think it's 10% planted as of the start of this week. And they're expanding area. The expectation is it'll produce over 140 million metric tons. For comparison, we produce, just over 120 million metric tons this year. So, it continues to grow. But I think the emphasis going forward is, how do we focus more on the, not necessarily the volume of beans that we're moving around and the volume that gets into, different channels of utilization going forward. I think it's about, showcasing the value of U.S. beans and the U.S. soy complex here. Again, I'll go back to the dare to compare messaging and how we think about, articulating that to animal nutritionists around the world. Okay, you might be paying a little bit more for U.S. origin soy meal or meal crush from U.S. beans, but the performance due to fundamental nutrient profiles within that meal, the animal performance is palpably improved relative to other origins there. So there's more of an intrinsic value per ton of meal from one origin versus another. So I think showcasing that becomes more and more important. So we're not just in this perpetual commoditized cycle where guess what, you said it earlier, there's 350 million acres of row crops here in the U.S. Thereabout. Well, we're not adding another 40 million acres here in the U.S. We don't have the luxury of doing that, nor would it be responsible for us to do that. I think particularly when we're trying to produce more and more efficiently on a small and ideally shrinking geographical footprint.
Mm-hmm. All right, last question from my man, Mac. Tell a lot about shipping. A lot of our stuff goes overseas. Soybeans are about the oldest GMO crop, meaning in 1996, we genetically engineered, well, we did it before that. It got approved for use, the Roundup Ready soybean. I heard about this. I was away from the farm. I was a political comedian at the time. I thought, holy hell, all that walking soybean fields out there with the volunteer corn. Now you just go and spray Roundup on it and it kills everything but the soybean. Oh, hallelujah. Europe does not take our GMO soybeans, right? What's going to happen there? Is Europe going to be a customer of ours? Is Europe going to not be? Or what's the story with the EU?
Well, the European Union, I mean, if we look back 15 years, to the start of USEC, we've seen that market grow pretty substantially for U.S. soy meal and whole beans. Just looking at our cultivation practices here in the U.S., about 94% of all our soybeans planted are genetically modified, with that herbicide tolerant trait, the Roundup Ready trait. That hasn't inhibited Europe from being a large end market for us. Mexico is our number 2 if you combine everything on a volume basis, but the European Union as a whole is our number 3 largest destination there. And part of that is that, they do import GM whole beans and
I thought the rule was that you couldn't import GMO crops, or maybe it's that you can't grow them there. What is
no, so there's a cultivation ban there on GM food crops, but when trait providers in the U.S. are looking to commercialize a trait, naturally you have to get it approved for commercialization in the country of cultivation. So if a new GM variety is being launched in the U.S., naturally you need to have approval to cultivate it in the U.S. But you also have to seek approval from all of the major trading partners, and that requires transportability of feeding studies, of environmental toxicity studies. All of that is part of the dossier that goes through to get approval from all these major markets. In no particular order. China, Europe, Mexico. These are our top 3 destination markets. So when new traits come or being introduced and on a path to commercialization, part of the hurdles that have to be cleared are securing approvals from those import countries as well. And,
so we're not going to have a problem. We're not going to have a problem with keeping EU as a customer.
No, not from that standpoint. And even this past year, I think it's a smaller market for us, but I think it's still a success worth noting. Turkey, for that same rationale, was not importing GM soy from us, and now they are. So that market access piece remains critical, and we've got a great team at USEC, who's working on that as well to ensure that as many customers around the globe can continue to enjoy a product that factors into a lot of their domestic animal agriculture.
Last point you want to make, the last point you want to share with anybody on behalf of Mac Marshall, the Vice President of Market Intelligence, the United Soybean Board. What thing would you want to tell? What thing did we not cover? What thing needs to be said that we didn't discuss about soybeans?
Well, let's bookend it all here. I mean, you've got an audience here which covers, a wide swath. It's farmers, it's investors, it's people who, are just looking to learn a little bit more about agriculture. Maybe it enhances their portfolio, maybe it enhances their understanding of where agriculture fits into, kind of the broader sector of society and commerce. So, I'm just on a personal note, I'm from the East Coast. Like I grew up all up and down the East Coast where, it's not a large, traditional row crop, production zone. So why do I work in agriculture? Why am I excited to work for, the U.S. Soybean Board? Why did I move out to Missouri 7 years ago and to get involved in agribusiness? Well, I think, agribusiness is it's absolutely critical. It's the one, sector of the economy, whether, wherever you play in the value chain, where, you materially have the opportunity to, touch every person on earth. And I don't think it's overstating that. Everybody eats every day. Everybody needs food, fuel, feed, fiber. And soy plays a role in all those things. We talked about the twin challenges of energy independence and food security. It means a great deal to me that I can be a part of an organization, part of a larger industry and enterprise that helps advance those things, globally. I love my job. I love my work. I love the kind of the ecosystem in which I operate, but, I could be doing the same thing day by day outside of agriculture, and it wouldn't be nearly as appealing to me. So I guess just a message for everyone. I'm glad you're tuning in here and getting a little bit more of that perspective, because really it all starts with ag. If you live in a city, we live in cities because of agriculture. But that's probably a story for another day.
Whew. I love it. I love it. All right. His name's Mac Marshall. If they want to look you up because they want to learn a little bit about something, they have a check-off question, they want to know something, how do they find you?
Well, a couple different channels. So there's, of course, the USB, our soy checkoff website at unitedsoybean.org. We also have usec.org, which is the Export Council's website, and ussoy.org, which is kind of our umbrella branded approach here. And on those latter two websites, I'm actually doing a webcast tonight about the WASDE that came out this morning. That's World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates. Do it every month. Got it at 7 Central on the 12th. And then you can follow me on Twitter at _YoSoyMac. And I'm also on LinkedIn as well.
Mac Marshall, you can find him at LinkedIn. You can find him on Twitter. And you know what? He's got a good wealth of information. I'm glad you came on. Thanks for being here, my friend.
It was a pleasure, Damian. Thank you very much for having me.
Till next time, it's the Business of Agriculture.
This episode of The Business of Agriculture was brought to you by Land Trust. Landowners, just like you, are increasing profitability by adding recreation to their portfolio of land use. Millions of recreators actively seek wide-open spaces for birdwatching, photography, hunting, fishing, horseback riding, and many other farm and ranch activities. Owners of farm and ranch properties are partnering with recreation access network Land Trust. Land Trust is an online platform connecting recreators with landowners for outdoor experiences on their land to increase profitability. Visit landtrust.com/BOA, as in Business of Agriculture, to learn more. That's landtrust.com/BOA.